Hello, everybody, and welcome to Canadian Regulatory Fireside Chats. Now, before the pandemic, GR folks used to get together, especially on Fridays at lunch and network, and they would learn from their peers, troubleshoot different issues, and brush up on tips. But unfortunately, with the pandemic now, it's a thing of the past. And it's really in this spirit that we started Canadian Regulatory Fireside Chats. Now, there's been a massive lack of information out there, especially in our social media feeds, about the fantastic work that people in the space are up to. And so we're really proud to be part of the solution. Now, the series is meant to be a platform for champions of industry from government relations, policy, and regulatory teams to share their take on best practices, overcoming challenges, and educating others. Now, if you're a fan of the chats, please feel free to like, share, and join into the conversation. And now it's time to take a look at some of the housekeeping rules. So as always, it's a 30-minute session. There's a Q&A in the chat. You can take a moment to locate that in the Zoom call below. The recording will be shared after the event, and if you're someone who likes to live tweet, our hashtag is hashtag Fireside Chats, and our handle is at Knowit, G-N-O-W-I-T. Now, if you're interested in becoming a speaker, you can always send us an email to hello@knowit.com, and there's always different topics and industries. Really, the goal is to share as much insights as possible. And on that note, I'm your host, Tan Sukera. I'm the VP of Insights for Knowit Inc., and we're always and still are really trying to improve, so we're eager to learn and welcome all of your feedback. Now, this talk is powered by Knowit Inc., and for those who don't know, we're a media, regulatory, and business intelligence company. We use AI and machine learning to actively search federal, provincial, and municipal government sources of information online. This includes the Hansard, Parliament, the gazettes, committees, debates, requests for consultations, regulatory bodies, government agencies, live video feeds, and more. And you can visit www.knowit.com for more information. So it's my favorite time of the chat where I get to introduce our speaker for today. We're on episode 15, Navigating Regulatory Environments, and I've got David Adams with me. He's the president of Global Automakers of Canada. He has more than 30 years of experience in the Canadian automotive industry. He brings a unique perspective to the industry, being the only individual to have served in executive roles with both of Canada's leading automotive industry associations. He's been at the forefront of associations' thought leadership in zero-emission vehicles and their adoption, as well as the regulatory environments that are necessary to support the adoption of automated and connected vehicles. Now, without any further ado, you can take it away, David.
Well, thanks very much, Tan. I appreciate that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I thought I might start off by just informing your viewers a little bit more about what the Global Automakers of Canada is and does. We're a national trade association. We have 15 member companies that essentially represent all of the European, Japanese, and Korean automakers in the Canadian automotive marketplace. Two of our members also produce vehicles here, Honda and Toyota, as some of the viewers may be aware. And actually, a little known fact is that Toyota has been the largest producer of vehicles in Canada for the last couple of years now, followed closely by Honda, which is a different maybe assumption than a lot of people might think about when they think about who are the largest automakers in Canada. But our focus of our activity is to really advocate on behalf of our members in front of various governments, primarily the federal government, which regulates the motor vehicle itself, but also provincial governments, which regulate the motor vehicle's use on the road. So it's an interesting dynamic at times, depending on what the issue happens to be that the association is dealing with. Who we have to engage, and sometimes it's also it's engaging with both governments on the same time on the same or a similar facet of the same issue. And what I thought I might do is just take your viewers through really how we approach regulation generally, and then we can get into some of the specifics that you kindly outlined in the introduction. So I think from our perspective as companies, we prefer to see regulation only where it's necessary, and that maybe sounds like a big business kind of mode of operating. But I think what the reality is that increasingly we're finding the regulatory world more and more complex, and there are lots of challenges with regulating. And I think let me look at it from two ways: the speed with which regulation can advance at the same time that technology is advancing. And I think what we're finding is that technology is advancing sort of exponentially, in some ways faster than the regulatory regime can keep up with regulating the technology, if you will. So I think our perspective would be is that regulation if necessary, but not necessarily regulation. The advantages I think that you can look at from an automaker of regulation are that it provides certainty. But as I said, the disadvantage is sometimes the complexity and the layering of regulation, which makes it increasingly challenging to conduct business in the world in which we're in at the moment. So let me, if I can just talk a little bit about non-regulatory approaches to regulation for a moment, to highlight some of the work that we've done in the past as an association. And largely, just again, for your viewers' edification, Canada has typically followed the United States in how it's regulated from both a safety and an emissions perspective. Because the sales environment, at least, is essentially an integrated market on a North American basis, arriving from, as a byproduct rather, of the Auto Pact back in 1965. It's important to have our regulatory regimes as aligned as possible as well. So two things that we saw rising in the United States, this is back maybe 25 years ago. One example would be lemon laws, and some of the viewers may be familiar with lemon laws. They were put in place when vehicle quality wasn't as good as it is now. And it was designed to address the situation of consumers where they were having a number of different problems and challenges with their vehicle, always taking it back to the dealership and not being able to get those problems resolved. What lemon laws did, and lemon being, I bought a lemon vehicle that wasn't working the way it was supposed to, were designed to say, basically put in a construct where if a consumer purchased a vehicle and had it in the shop more than 3 times generally for the same repair attempt, then the laws were structured such that the manufacturer could be forced to buy that vehicle back. These lemon laws spread throughout the United States, Canada back in the 90s, Ontario and specifically looked at introducing a lemon law, and the automotive industry at the time was saying, well, we don't think that that's a really viable solution to have a specific lemon law in Ontario, and we think that there's a better way of addressing the same challenge. So what the industry did with the cooperation of the Consumers Association of Canada and the various provinces was to establish a voluntary arbitration organization, essentially a private court, if you will, to handle these types of challenges. And that we structured that as the Canadian Motor Vehicle Arbitration Plan, and it's still in existence today, whereby consumers, if they have a problem or an issue with their vehicle on an extended period, over an extended period of time, with the same type of issue or concern, can apply for, called CAMBAP, the acronym, can apply for CAMBAP. They can have their case heard in front of a completely independent arbitrator. And the arbitrator can, at the end of the day, find that the consumer's complaint is not valid, or can also determine that, fair enough, the consumer does have some valid complaints and has tried to get their vehicle fixed and hasn't been able to, and warrants a buyback of the vehicle. So this is a process that was completely a private court, as I say, if you will, that is set up and funded by the automotive industry, but is administered at an arm's length basis by a 3-person office in Toronto, and it's been functioning quite well for the last 25 years or so. And again, we recognized a problem that could be a problem for the Canadian automakers. There are automakers operating the Canadian marketplace. We didn't want the cost and the complexity and the lack of uniformity, if you will, amongst the different that we saw amongst the different states. So we established a national program that provided consumers with the same type of outcome at the end of the day. So one example of a non-regulatory solution, if you will. Another example of a similar type of a situation was the advancement, I guess, of what are known as franchise laws in the United States. I think the franchise legislation in the various states was, and what I mean by that is the relationship that evolved between a franchisor, whether it's McDonald's and the McDonald's restaurants, or in our industry, the situation that arises between a manufacturer and their dealers. Various franchise laws were put in place in all of the different states as well that essentially try to ensure that manufacturers didn't put more dealers in a particular geographic regime than could potentially be supported, and provide the dealers that were in those geographic areas with the type of business that they maybe were anticipating when they signed up with the manufacturer. So again, Canada looked at putting in place, I believe it was Ontario, or actually it might have been Alberta at the time, was looking at putting in place franchise legislation. Some of it, as far as the automotive industry was concerned, would be mirrored after what was occurring in the United States. Again, we took the opportunity to look at a private court approach, same type of approach that we did with the consumer arbitration program, and we established the National Automobile Dealer Arbitration Program, which again addresses the issues and concerns that can arise from time to time between manufacturers and dealers without having to resort to the courts and to litigation to resolve these concerns, or having any particular federal or provincial legislation in place to govern the relationship between manufacturers and dealers in that context. So those are a few examples of non-regulatory approaches to issues that arose, I guess, in both those situations, one between manufacturers and consumers, and the other between manufacturers and dealers. And both of those programs continue today, and both of them have been, I think, working well for the parties on both sides of the particular issues, whether it was problems between manufacturers and dealers, or issues that consumers have with their new vehicles with their particular manufacturers. I mentioned a moment ago the necessity in the automotive industry of having similar regulatory regimes in Canada and the United States. And I also mentioned that this actually goes back to 1965, and what happened in 1965 was the establishment of the Auto Pact. So the Automotive Products Trade Agreement, as its formal name it was called, which at the time was the largest sectoral free trade agreement between two countries anywhere in the world. It essentially established, if you want to call it managed trade, it wasn't necessarily free trade, but managed trade in automobiles between Canada and the United States. And what that allowed the industry to do in both countries was to essentially take advantage of economies of scale, and the production facilities that they had in Canada could be used to service the entire North American marketplace, just the same as the production facilities in the US could be utilized to service the entire North American marketplace. Because prior to the Auto Pact, you ended up having automakers that were producing vehicles, a number of different vehicles, basically on one assembly line, which, as you can imagine, was very inefficient and also very, very costly. Canada had in place very high tariffs at that point in time as well, which meant that consumers were not getting a wide variety of vehicles available, and really the cost of those vehicles was more than it had to be if we had lower tariffs and a trade agreement in place. And the Auto Pact brought about both lower tariffs, really tariff-free trade between Canada and the United States in vehicles, and accomplishing two things. One, a greater supply of vehicles and variety of vehicles in the Canadian marketplace, and also vehicles at lower cost. And then those agreements were essentially expanded upon in the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, ultimately NAFTA. And as some of you may know, autos were at the heart of the recently negotiated, I guess a year and a bit ago now, Canada-US-Mexico agreement, or the USMCA, depending on which country you're in, which acronym you want to apply to that agreement. So having that, I guess, really regional trade established in automobiles then required that our standards become a lot closer than they are or were at that point in time. So emission standards, we tend to have a better history of developing our standards in concert with those of the United States. And on the safety side, that took a little bit longer. And some of you that maybe have white hair or no hair like me will remember that there was a time when Canada had different bumper standards, for instance, than the US did. And if you wanted to bring a vehicle in from the United States as a used vehicle, it had to be homologated to meet the standards of the Canadian marketplace, and vice versa if you wanted to take a vehicle into the United States. So we've done a fair amount of heavy lifting over the course of the last couple of decades to bring those safety standards more in alignment with those of the United States. There's still a few things. Daytime running lights, for instance, are more of a sort of a unique Canadian proposition than in the US, but by and large, all of our safety standards are more or less aligned with those of the United States now. Likewise on the emission side of things. And this is important as we move forward, speaking specifically of the emission standards now, as we move forward down the road towards ever more stringent emission standards, leading to ultimately to the decarbonization of light duty motor vehicles. And what I mean by that is, essentially vehicles that are producing zero or near zero emissions from a tailpipe perspective. So really the transition to the electrification or other forms of zero emission vehicles could be hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and that type of thing. And the necessity, I guess, for having those regulations harmonized is that Canada, if you look at it in the broader scheme of the world, is a relatively small automotive jurisdiction. We've got about 2% of the global production of vehicles here in Canada and about 2% of the sales. So it's important to continue to offer consumers the variety of vehicles that we're offering them, and I guess the vehicles that are most advanced in the marketplace and at the lowest possible cost. It's important for us to ensure that those standards are aligned in Canada with a larger jurisdiction. And given that the US is right next door to us, that's been the partner that we've typically aligned our standards, both emissions and safety standards, with. I can switch gears for a moment now to some of the other regulatory challenges in front of the automotive industry. Tan mentioned, she mentioned some of them at the outset of our discussion. These would be around, I mentioned one of them just a moment ago, but electric vehicle propulsion, for instance, but then also into the world of connected and automated vehicles. So some people think of connected and automated vehicles being sort of the same thing. They're related, but they're not exactly the same thing. When we're talking about automated vehicles, we're talking about vehicles that have advanced driver assistance systems in them, varying levels of advanced driver assistance systems, meaning the little lights in your mirror that warn you that there's a vehicle next to you, to more active systems which actually would steer your car back in the lane if you're going over the lane line without putting your indicator on, for instance, all the way up to what some people view as the utopia of automated driving, which would be the fully automated vehicle where somebody can be in the back seat, have no cares, or be a passenger on a multi-passenger vehicle without a driver in that vehicle, being ferried to their destination, whether that be work or the shopping mall or wherever it might happen to be. And I think our assessment in the industry is that that fully automated world is still a number of decades off, at least for that technology to be pervasive in our society. But you will see applications of automated vehicle technology being used in geo-fenced areas, meaning locations that are essentially technologically fenced off for the functionality of the automated vehicle to operate in. And those we will see, and currently you may be aware of them being utilized in certain locations around the world. Those applications will become certainly a lot more common as time moves forward, but it will be a while before we can just leave the full task of driving anyway to somebody else. But this technology is iterative, so every new model of vehicle or platform of vehicle that is coming out tends to have more and more automated features applied to the vehicle. And this is, I think, the way that the automated vehicle technology will evolve. The challenge, as I mentioned at the outset, is that the regulatory environment is not really keeping up with the evolution, not only the evolution of this technology, but the application of this technology in the vehicle. And I think, a good case in point would be Tesla with their autopilot feature in their vehicles. It was something that essentially was put in the vehicles that the driver was allowed to use, but there were no sort of rules and regulations around what this technology should or should not be capable of doing, and when it should or shouldn't be used. So, currently right now, there are global efforts around to develop regulations in the automated vehicle space and also in the connected vehicle space. Maybe just touch on the connected vehicle space for a moment. So automated vehicles can certainly operate without necessarily being connected to anything else. Connectivity really has two real, I guess, modes to it. One would be the connection that you would see to the actual internet to provide in-vehicle entertainment, for instance, and the ability to use other applications while you're in your vehicle. So the whole connection to the internet would be one application of connectivity. Another application of connectivity is more, as we see it, between the vehicle and other vehicles, and so that would be called V2V, the vehicle to infrastructure, for instance, and then vehicle to various other applications as well. And the whole idea of being connected to other vehicles and also to the infrastructure is ultimately to provide that opportunity, at least, where we could eliminate, if not all, but certainly the vast majority of accidents on our roadways. Because right now the most dangerous aspect of of driving isn't the vehicle itself, it's the person actually driving the vehicle. So the hope with the connected vehicle, and I would say the automated vehicle as well, is to provide that opportunity to essentially have zero deaths on the road from the utilization of motor vehicles. I did want to just touch briefly again on the regulation around connected vehicles as well. That I think is, I'm not as close to that, but that is advancing, I think in many ways more quickly than automated vehicles is, because there have to be certain standards that are developed to facilitate that intercommunication between vehicles, one another, excuse me, and also the vehicle landscape, the environment in which it operates. And there are various technologies that were being looked at. A secure message system was the initial thought that could be utilized to allow this connectivity to basically be, I guess, to be made ubiquitous amongst vehicles. But more and more now, I think 5G networks and whatnot are the tool that are being looked at to facilitate the connectivity between vehicles, and also the connectivity between the vehicle and the road infrastructure and whatnot. Firm decision, I don't think, is yet to be made on which technology will prevail, and I suspect it actually may be both technologies that will be utilized as we move forward, because each one of them has various aspects where they perform better than the other. But needless to say, whether we're talking about connected vehicle technology, automated vehicle technology, or electric propulsion, this is still a very sort of nascent and evolving space, and I think it provides really the entire global automotive community with the opportunity to develop standards and regulations that are global in nature. And why is that a good thing? I think for the same reason that I alluded to a few moments ago, that I think to the extent that you can have automakers that are developing vehicles to meet one global standard, as opposed to perhaps 3, 4, 5 regional standards around the world, then obviously the cost of developing vehicles is reduced. The compliance costs of developing vehicles are minimized, and my sense is that is a real opportunity for the industry in these, as they kind of new and evolving areas of the automotive industry, as opposed to trying to have to essentially retrofit our regulations, if you will, as we've had to do in the past on our safety and emissions regulations. Because the other interesting thing about regulations is oftentimes they can be utilized by jurisdictions as essentially non-tariff barriers to trade. So your safety standards don't meet our safety standards. It doesn't necessarily mean that one set of safety standards is better than the other. Currently, the challenge would be, if I had to look at it on a global basis, between what are called the UN ECE standards, or the United Nations standards that are developed for vehicles essentially everywhere in Europe and elsewhere, vis-a-vis the federal motor vehicle safety standards, for instance, in the United States, or the Canadian motor vehicle safety standards that are essentially, for all intents and purposes, the same as the federal motor vehicle safety standards in North America right now. Are the standards better or worse? you could probably make the case that sometimes the European standards are better, sometimes the American standards would be better. But I think if you look at, if we're trying to eventually get our safety standards and emission standards to the same place that we have the opportunity to go with these new technologies, we will never get there if we look at individual standards, because there are just so many of them, and the test methodologies, the different ways of approaching the standards, just make it such that unless you sort of take a holistic look at things and say, well, okay, we both sets of standards are trying to achieve the same goal. So if they're essentially achieving the same goal and they are, from a performance perspective, are achieving that goal, do we really need to quibble about the details, so to speak? Lots of people do want to quibble about the details, but I would say that we're never really going to get to global standards on the areas of emissions and safety if we're looking at the detail. Conversely, we have much more of an opportunity to develop and evolve those global standards if we're looking at these new technologies, whether there be propulsion technologies or automated and connected vehicles. I think the real challenge in these areas, though, is that, as I said at the very outset, that things are moving so quickly and evolving so fast that the regulatory regime, almost regardless of where it is in the world, really can't keep up. So then the discussion has to take place between regulators and the industry in terms of what other mechanisms can we use to achieve the outcome that we might like to achieve through regulation. And that could be some of these approaches that I mentioned at the outset, these voluntary non-regulatory approaches, alternative dispute resolution type mechanisms, or it could be initiatives such as industry and governments working on broad guidance documents. Again, not necessarily specifying the detail, but specifying almost from a performance basis the outcome of what government would like to see, regulators would like to see as a result of technology being integrated into the vehicle. So it's a very sort of interesting time. I think it's a challenging time for automakers now, just because of the I guess the variability in the regulatory environment in which they're operating at the moment. But I mean, I think it's also an exciting time just to see the speed with which the technology in all of these areas is evolving and is being integrated into the motor vehicle. And it's also a challenge and an opportunity, I think, for those that are in organizations like mine that are dealing with regulators and dealing with, I guess, what would have been kind of a typical regulatory process where we might have pre-discussions with Transport Canada about a particular standard that they would like to achieve. We would know what the regulatory plan was in terms of, okay, next year in the first quarter, we're going to see a Part 1 Canada Gazette notice around this particular regulation, and then that would be followed by more consultation, and then a Part 2, and then eventually the regulation would come into effect. And that whole timing, in a way, it hasn't gone completely out of the window, but it's both regulators and the industry are having to adjust to this new environment, as I say, where things are evolving much more quickly than can be appropriately dealt with from a regulatory perspective. So how do we collectively figure out, how do we ensure that consumers are getting the utility, the convenience, the other aspects that they're aware of now that are available in motor vehicles? So how can we provide the consumers with all of the functionality that they're desiring, while at the same time meet the regulators' needs of keeping vehicles and, more importantly, the drivers of those vehicles safe and operating efficiently and effectively in the marketplace. And I think the other side of that coin too is that regulators want to ensure that that there are consequences, I suppose, for manufacturers that that aren't meeting either the spirit of the regulation or the the actual intent of the regulation. And more importantly, as we move forward, if we have sort of a more collective guideline approach, well, what are the consequences of not meeting a guideline approach? So I think this maybe comes full circle to where I started in terms of regulation if necessary, but not necessarily regulation. Regulation, I think, is desirable in some respects because it provides certainty to manufacturers and everyone else that's subject to regulations about what you really have to do and what you cannot do. The challenges of regulation is that currently, I think, is that it's being it's being kind of outmoded in a way by the pace of development, which I've mentioned a few times here now. I think I've sort of covered the waterfront of the things that I wanted to share with you and your viewers today, Tan. So maybe with that, I'll turn it back to you if there are any questions from your viewers.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that, David. It was really informative, and I thought that was really well put. Now it's time for the last 5 minutes of the call where we'll go through some of the Q&A that's happening here. So let's take a look at question number 1. So what are some of the areas of regulation that you're dealing with now that maybe you haven't had to kind of deal with, say, 5 to 10 years ago?
Well, yeah, thanks for that question. And it's an interesting one because we still have essentially the same staff complement at the association, but a whole new sort of realm of regulations and whatnot that we haven't had to deal with before. I mentioned some of those in my remarks. So when we look at connected and automated vehicles, for instance, and also propulsion technology as well, those are things that by and large weren't on our radar screen. Now, certainly 10 years ago, and probably not even 5 years ago either. I think one of the other issues that's come to the forefront more recently has been the whole area of regulating kind of end-of-life issues related to the vehicle, for instance. So in the broader scheme of things, those regulations would sort of fall under something known as stewardship or extended producer responsibility areas where, and again, this is more at a provincial jurisdiction than it is at a federal jurisdiction. So that requires a more holistic approach to dealing with these issues as well, which is, again, a challenge. But no, just in the sense that there's a recognition, not just for the automobile, but a lot of products that are in our marketplace today, that the desire of governments, not only in Canada, but around the world, is that producers take responsibility of their product at the end of its useful life, so that we don't have landfill consequences and whatnot. And interestingly, two of these issues, regulation of electric vehicles and also now the extended producer responsibilities associated with the battery, when people start thinking about getting more electric vehicles on the road, have both kind of converged in terms of being two areas that that we haven't had to deal with, let's say, in the past, over at least the past 5 to 10 years anyway.
And the next question here is, what are some of the difficult challenges with regulatory authorities?
Well, one of the challenges that we find, I think, sometimes in Canada is it gets down to sovereignty issues, I suppose, in a way. In my remarks, I noted that from the automotive industry's perspective, it's best when we have a aligned regulatory regime with that of the United States, with some some variability, I guess, to integrate potentially other global standards as well. But just because of our proximity, it makes sense to align with the United States. And sometimes Canada, as a sovereign nation, wants to proceed with regulations that are perhaps unique to itself. And I think our challenge sometimes is that those unique regulations can cause havoc with the automobile industry. I noted in my comments that our market in Canada is relatively small, and there are challenges that arise when Canada takes a unique position on something from a regulatory standpoint that would not be aligned with, say, the United States or maybe Europe, or looking at other global standards, for instance. And one such area, for instance, would be Canada's chemical management plan, and it's an issue for our industry, but also other industries as well in Canada, where Canada has taken very much a leadership role, kind of globally, in managing chemicals. But the reality is that if Canada is looking to ban a certain chemical and it's utilized in motor vehicles or other electronics or what have you, then it becomes a real challenge in terms of what that means for the availability of automobiles or products in the Canadian marketplace.
100%. Well, if that's all the questions for this afternoon, I just want to say thank you again so much, David, for such an insightful talk. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon, and wishing everybody a great weekend ahead.
Thanks very much for having me, Tim. I appreciate it.